Hi everyone, it's Lindsay. Welcome back to another video. I love making scenes on my cards, and today I want to share with you how you make handmade greeting cards with inset scenes. On my first card, I'm going to be using this stamp set from Joy Claire. It's called Spring Stroll. It's perfect for or wishing that it was this time of year, I guess. It's still so cold where I live. But I'm going to start out by stamping out my little bicycle that's going to be the focal point of my scene. The reason I'm stamping this first is because I'm going to trim it down and not fussy cut it at first, but just trim it down to where it has a nice edge that is even around all the sides of it. That is going to be my outline for how big my frame needs to be. This is a great way to create a frame for your scene without having to use a die cut. I know a lot of us have die cut machines, but not everyone does, and not everyone wants to invest in one. So if you don't have a die cut machine, you can still do this technique. All I did was outline that rectangle with a pencil, and then I'm going to go slightly outside of that and cut out with my ruler. I'm using the Tim Holtz ruler and my craft knife. To make sure this is even all the way around on all the sides of my little panel here, I'm using that ruler and lining up 3/4 of an inch from the outside. That is going to cut out all of my pencil marks, so my frame will be large enough, but it's also going to give me a nice even edge all the way around. Now, craft knives can be a little finicky. I know they're kind of hard to cut with sometimes, especially if my hands just aren't having it that day. So what I like to do is take my scissors when all is said and done and just cut off those little pieces that might be scraggly on there. Super easy to do. Once I have that done, my frame is ready to go for my scene. Now, I want to add a little something to this frame, so I'm going to do that before I put it on my card. I'm using that little corner flower to add to my corners of my frame. I'm using my Misty to do this, and I am stamping down with Memento Tuxedo black ink. I'm stamping with that ink because I am going to use colored pencils and OMS or Gamsol to color in those little flowers. You could absolutely stamp these with just a colored ink and leave them as is, but I'm going to add a little bit of color. And to make sure this was nice and even on both corners, all I did to stamp the next corner was just flip this around and stamp in the opposite corner. Super easy to do, especially with your stamp positioner. If you don't have a stamp positioner, this is very easy to stamp with an acrylic block as well. To color in all of my images, not only my little flowers here, but also my bicycle, and I also stamped the little banner, the hanging banner in that stamp set. I stamped all of those with Memento Tuxedo black ink, and then I'm going to color these in with colored pencils and OMS. I'm not going to put all the coloring in this video. And the reason is because I already have a video that I just did that is all about coloring with your colored pencils and OMS. That's going to give you all the information you need. I will leave that link down in the description box below. Here, I wanted a nice soft wash of color, nothing too intense. So I actually decided to use colored pencils that are from, like, you can buy them at Walmart or Target, and these are just the Crayola and Crazy Art brands. They're kind of mixed up. My kids use these, but I stole them for this card, and I colored in all of my images with those. Next up, I need to go ahead and create anything that I want behind my scene, which is going to be on the card base before I put anything down. So whenever you're thinking of your scene and you're putting it onto your card, you need to think from the very back of your scene forward. In order to do this, I need to go ahead and ink blend my background before I put anything on. I'm ink blending that background straight onto the card base, and I don't want any of that ink blending to show outside of my frame, so I'll just do some quick masking to make sure that all of those edges stay nice and bright and white. For my background, I am just quickly blending on some Salty Ocean Distressing with my mini ink blending tool, and that's all there is to creating that background. Now, you don't just have to use your ink blending and your stamped images to create your scenes. You can also bring in some die cuts too, and that's what I'm doing here. I'm just die cutting some grass with these MFT grass border dies, and then I can start putting my scene together once I have all of my components ready to go. You never want to start putting it together until you have everything ready, just because you never know if you're going to want to add something. Now, another suggestion while I'm putting together this scene, I would suggest laying everything out without any glue before you start gluing anything down. Once you glue it down, it's pretty much there, unless you have adhesive remover. And then sometimes you can even rip your objects, things like that. So lay it out, get a feel of where you want everything to go, and also what kind of adhesive you're going to be using. So for this frame, I'm starting from the front and I'll work my way towards the back. On that very front, I wanted a piece of grass, the shorter grass from that border die set, and I glued that down with non-dimensional adhesive. I used tape, but you could absolutely use liquid adhesive for that. Then next up, I wanted my little bike. So for that, I'm going to add glue just to the very bottom of those tires to hold that in place. I also added that little banner that connected to the frame, and I added that with non-dimensional adhesive as well. Then it's time to put on my dimensional adhesive. I want my longest blades of grass to be on a different level. I want them to look like they are further behind that bike. So I'm adding that dimensional adhesive to give it a little bit more space between the bike and that grass. Then I can go ahead and remove the rest of the backing paper and add some liquid adhesive to that grassy panel just to make sure everything stays in place. Finally, it's time to add this over the card base, which is my very last kind of layer in this scene, which is the ink blending. And then once you put that down, you've got that nice blue sky background that shows up behind the grass. Then you've got that furthest grass panel, your bike, and then you finally have that last grassy panel in the very front, all condensed within that frame. Kind of confusing to put scenes together, I know, but if you lay it out beforehand and get an idea of where you want everything to go, it comes together seamlessly. The last thing I did was add that thinking of you sentiment right down there on the bottom of the frame, and that finished this card off. Moving on to my next card, I'm going to be using this Wish Big stamp set from Joy Claire Stamps, and again, this is a great one to create a scene with. Now for this, I am going to be using die cuts to cut out my frames. And that's because I'm going to double up on my frames and create two different sizes and layer them up. That is a great way for adding some extra dimension and also just a little bit more interest to a very simple card. I'm using these oval die cuts. This is a nesting die set from Waffle Flower. The price on these is really great and you get a lot in this die set. I'm using a smaller die first and die cutting it from an A2 sized panel. Then I'll take the inside of that die cut, the oval that it die cut out, center that up on my second panel, and then I'll center the larger oval around that die cut. This is going to allow me to end up with not only my two frames, but then I have my full ovals for use on a different card, and they're not cut apart at all. So that just gives me a nice guide to where I can cut out those frames and make them nice and even. To make sure that my stamping is lined up where I want it to be inside of that frame, I'm going to overlay my smallest frame over my A2 size card base in my MISTI and line up my stamp through that frame. Then I can remove the frame and stamp directly onto the card base. That is going to be my last layer in the scene and the furthest back in the scene, so I want this to go directly onto the card base. And again, I'm stamping with Memento Tuxedo Black ink because I will be coloring this in with colored pencils and OMS. Now, aside from this strip of flowers, I also stamped out with the same ink on plain white cardstock, just a scrap piece, the little butterfly in the set, and also the kind of hanging flowers. I don't know my flower names, but those flowers, and I colored all of my images in with Prismacolor pencils and blended them out with OMS. Again, if you want to learn more about coloring with colored pencils and OMS, check out that video down below. Then I fussy cut just my butterfly and my two little flowers. Now it's time to lay everything out and get an idea of where I want everything to go, and also what I want to have dimension, what I want glued directly down to the card base, and get a feel for how I want this to end up. It's also going to give me a good idea of where I want my sentiment to go. So for this, I'm going to stamp my sentiment on the very outside frame, which has the largest oval die cut in it. I'm using the Wish Big sentiment from the Wish Big stamp set and lining it up in the bottom right-hand corner of that frame using my Misty. And for this, I'm going to use VersaFine Clear in Nocturne. It's my favorite ink to use for my sentiments. It's nice and black, and it's a pigment ink that dries pretty quickly, and it stamps beautifully. So I'll stamp that down quickly in that corner, and then it's time to put everything together. So my smallest frame, I'm going to go ahead and glue that directly down onto the card base with liquid adhesive. This is just going to give me that little bit of playtime to make sure this is nice and lined up and get everything even before the glue sets. I like to use liquid adhesive when I need something aligned properly, so I have that playtime to play around with the placement. It's super helpful when putting full panels on your card. Now while that dries, I'm going to go ahead and apply foam adhesive to the back of my smaller frame. And that is going to allow me to glue on one of my hanging flowers. Then to make sure that flower stays put, I'll put a little bit of liquid adhesive on the back of that and then put this frame, the larger opening, over the smaller opening. It makes sense if you look at the video. So I'll place that down. Now for this, I am using dimensional adhesive on the back, so it's going to give a little bit of shadow between the two frames, and it's also going to give me a place to tuck those little flowers. Now that first flower that I put, I glued directly down with liquid adhesive. But the second one, I'll go ahead and add a little bit of dimensional adhesive on the back and tuck it underneath that frame. That's going to put it on a different dimensional level than that first flower, but it still looks like the same flower. It's just a little bit closer to the front of the scene. Finally, I'll add my little butterfly with some dimensional adhesive, and that's it. I have this dimensional scene that has the inset frames, really beautiful and super easy to do. My best advice for creating scenes is just to lay them out beforehand. Make sure that you get an idea of what you want popped up, what you want glued directly down with liquid adhesive, and work from the back forward. I hope you guys enjoyed this video and a look at how I made these two cards with their inset scenes. That is going to do it for me today. Don't forget all the information down in the description box below, including the supply list. And if you haven't subscribed to my channel, be sure to do so now. Thanks for watching and happy crafting.